So yesterday's daf, today's daf is daf Chaf Dal 24. So yesterday, of course, we talked about a lot of things in which there's, two similar features, let's say, and then we talked about the differences. So today we extend this at the beginning of the Mishnah, at the top of not the top, or a third of the way down the Mishnah on daf Chaf Dal Amud Aleph. Says the Mishnah, Kasher b'Kohanim, Pasul b'Leviim, Kasher b'Leviim, Pasul b'Kohanim. That which we're going to see what this is talking about, of course, in the Bright in a minute, but that which is kosher for a Kohen. Now, Kohen, of course, is hereditary, but there are certain criteria that define when a Kohen can do avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. Those are different, they're contrasting for Kohanim and Leviim. What does that mean? Tanu Rabbanan, says the Bright. Kohanim bimuman psulim. The factor that is important for a Kohen is, do they have a mum? If a Kohen has a broken leg, then they can't work in the Beit HaMikdash, right? If they have a wound on their skin, whatever, we'll learn all about these in Bechorot. But the Kohanim, the mumin are pasul, but bishanim ksherim, but age is not a pasul for Kohanim. So if long as they're capable of working, they can still keep working no matter what age they are. We'll see, not what age, but most ages. Leviim, but on the other hand, the Leviim, whose role in the Beit HaMikdash was quite different. They were primarily in the Mishkan, the ones who carried the Mishkan, and we'll see that's very relevant because they have to be physically fit, right? They also did singing, they also opened the gates, but carrying is the big point here. And there, b'muman kshirim, we don't care if they have a mum as long as they can function, right? They can have a scratch in their ear or whatever, and they're okay to carry the wood. But bishanim sulim, but if they age out, the Torah talks about the age of Leviim and gives very specific ages. 30 to 50 is what we're going to come out. We'll see why in a second. But therefore, Nimsa turns out kasher b'kohanim pasul b'leviim, kasher b'leviim pasul b'kohanim. So the main factor, age or mum, is contrasted between the Leviim and the Kohanim. Amanani. What is the source for this? Mainly the question is, what's the source of the age for the Leviim? The Tanur Rabbanan, because the pasuk says, now we're quoting Zot Asher La Leviim. This is a pasuk in next week's, well, I guess 2 weeks parsha, depending on where you are, right? Pasuk in Bamidbar Chet. Zot Asher La Leviim. This is for Leviim. I'm reading the pasuk. Mi ben chamesh v'esrim shana v'mala, from 25 years old. Yavol etzvot tzavav avodat oel moed. They come and work in the oel moed. Matam alomar. What's the point of that pasuk? Lefisha namar, because the pasuk says, another pasuk says, this is the next pasuk actually, mi ben chamishim shana, when they turn 50, yashuv mitzvah avodah, they come back from the work, and lo yavod od. So the pasuk is very clear, right? Lefisha namar, mi ben chamishim shana yashuv, lamani, we learn, Leviim shashanim psulim b'hem. You learn from that pasuk that when a Levi turns 50, they no longer can work in the Mishkan. Yachol, so you might have thought, well, by extension, if the age passes a Levi, for sure a mum should pass a Levi. Yachol muman poslim b'hem, that you'd think that a mum also passes a Levi v'dinu. It's a kal v'chomer. Ma kohanim, which we're going to learn in a little bit. She'ena shanim poslim b'hem. There's no age factor by kohanim. You can keep being a kohen well past retirement age. But mumin poslim b'hem. But if they get a mum, they are pasul. Leviim shashanim poslim b'hem. So by a Levi, where if you turn 50, you have to be forced retirement. Eino din she'e mumin posulim b'hem. Talmud, therefore it says, Zot asher la Leviim. It says in the pasuk, the pasuk we first quoted, this is the halacha for the Leviim. The word Zot tells you that Zot, where am I? Lost it. Zot asher la Leviim, sorry. Zot la Leviim, vein acheret la Leviim. This is the psul of Leviim, the age, the 50 years old, but there's no other psul. So Zot, this is the only rule of Leviim, is that you have to be a certain age. It says 25 to 50. We're going to see in a minute, it really means 30 to 50, but it stops at 50. Now continues the Braita, Yachol, we are, I don't know, just halfway down. Yachol yehe kohanim psulim bishanim. You might think that a Kohen should also be puzzled when he turns a certain age, let's say the same age, maybe 50, right? Why? Because dinu, right? It is a kal v'chomer. Ma Leviim, Levi, you just proved from the pasuk, she'ein mumin poslim b'hem. The only thing, the mum does not pasel a Levi, but only shanim poslim b'hem. So then, but age does. So kohanim, she'amumin poslim b'hem. So kohen, where we for sure know a mum is pasel, the pasuk says that explicitly. Eino din she'ei shanim poslim b'hem. Shouldn't age by a kohen be an issue? Talmud lomar asher la Leviim. It's zot. The pasuk continued only for Leviim. V'lo asher la kohanim. Okay, so we learn from the pasuk that only Levium have this rule that the age is a problem. Now, it turns out that, as I mentioned several times, the reason age is a problem is because you get weak and you can't carry when you get older. So the Mishkan, when they were in the midbar, right, the Levium had a very big function. They would have to take it apart, put it together. It was very heavy. It was very complex. They had to be quite master builders, as we're going to see in a minute. So their age has a big factor. You lose some of your strength and your ability as you get older, right? That is unfortunately the reality of the world. But you might think that that is also true later on when there's a permanent Beit HaMikdash. And the Levium actually no longer function as builders and carriers. They only are singers and gatekeepers, right? Which of course doesn't require the same physical strength. So Yachal, you might have thought that Af B'Shilo B'Beit Olamim Kain, that the age limits also apply all the time. Meaning, even in Shiloh, when it's a permanent Mishkan, or even in the Beit Olamim, when it's basically a Beit HaMikdash, Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says that, and this pasuk is actually a pasuk that we had in Naso. We'll have in Naso, depending on your reading. Mi ben shloshim shana v'mala. I'm reading the pasuk in Naso. V'ad ben chamishim shana. Here it says 30 to 50. Kol haba la'avod avodat avodah v'avodat masa. So it says the word here, Talmud Lomar, it says la'avod avodat avodah and avodat masa. They have to do the work of carrying. Lo amarti, I only set a limit on the age. El bisman shavodah b'katef. Only when you're actually carrying things on your shoulders, when your strength really, really matters. And so therefore, the halacha that a Levi can only work from 30 to 50 is only true in the Mishkan. In the Beit HaMikdash, Leviim don't time out when they turn 50. They don't have to retire because they're not carrying. They're just singing. And singing, of course, could go on beyond that. Now, you have to still be able to sing, we'll see. But it's not the same limit. Now, I asked the Gemara the question that I referenced a couple of times, is that one pasuk says 25 and one pasuk says 30, right? So Katuv Echad Omer in later in Chat, ben chamesh v'esrim shana v'mala, and then in Naso it says Katuv Echad Omer ben shloshim shana v'mala. So I don't understand. What is it when a Levi turns 25, they start working, or when they turn 30? You have shalom shloshim. You can't say it means 30. Shekvar nemer esrim chamesh. Already said 25. You have shalom esrim chamesh. Shekvar nemer shloshim. Haketzad. Says the Gemara, the obvious explanation is that it takes years of study to become a master Levi. So when you're 25, you enter Levi school, Levi University, right? After undergrad, probably, and army service. You enter Levi University. Chafei Lomod. You go into a university to learn when you're 25. Ushloshim la'avodah. And it takes 5 years to master it, and you're 30 when you start doing the avodah. Now, of course, it seems a little funny because we think of Levim as being basically schleppers, right? They're like movers. So obviously, it's not clearly all they're limited to. First of all, it's carrying. Second of all, it's building, right? So it's not like they just carry things. They have to know how the intricacy of taking it apart and putting it together, but presumably also require the Levium to be experts in kachim and taharot, right? So that could take us many years at this rate. So they spend 5 really intense years learning and mastering everything. And then when they're 30, they're ready to work in the Beit HaMikdash. The amazing thing about this, just to be clear, the Gemara says in a second, is that the Torah defines these ages. It's not like go to school and when you graduate, you'll be okay. The Torah says start when you're 25, go to the Beit HaMikdash when you're 30, basically saying you must spend 5 years in learning, right? And says the Gemara, a very interesting point, Mikan, what you see from here is the Talmid, Shelo Ra'ah Simin Yafam B'Mishnato, Chamisha Shanim Shuv Eino Ro'eh. You know, that's, if you try at it and you work hard and you're putting all the effort in and 5 years have passed and you're not a master at it, more time is not going to help you, right? If you don't finish your PhD in 5 years, maybe, doing it longer is not going to make any difference. And again, if you're not trying, if you could,
so it's not like Kohanim that were learning as they were growing up. And following and being mentored. This is like a specific point of time when they're supposed to be learning their trade.
So yes, but I mean, we obviously there was probably hands-on, right? I assume they did some of it practically. They must have had, a replica building, like an anatomy lab, where you did these things. So we don't know exactly, but yes, we'll see that Kohanim obviously started earlier. Now, there's not that being a Kohen is simple, as we've learned many times, but they did do some learning on the job. Though even with Kohanim, we'll see you don't start being a Kohen when you're 13. So there is an education. But anyways, the Levium needed 5 years, and that is the symbol that you should be able to master something in 5 years if it's going to come. Rabbi Yossi says, you know what, I don't agree with you about 5 years. Really, shlosha shanim. really, if you don't know, if you can't see Siman in 3 years of study, then move on, right? If you're studying something for 3 years and you don't feel like you're making headway, move on to the next thing. And what that's based on a very different pasuk, because there's a very, very interesting pasuk in the beginning of Daniel. And the pasuk in the beginning of Daniel describes that Nebuchadnezzar, or the kings of Bavel, the Kasdim, they would take children, right? They would take young, bright people, and they would basically bring them into school in the palace, and they would train them in the diplomatic corps. And the pasuk is a long pasuk in Daniel in the beginning, which describes what they would do. They would take these children. Remember, the reason we're saying is because Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were three of those children. But they would take Yiladim, they would take, young people, and the pasuk says, I'm reading it now, Asherim behem mum, v'tovei mareh, maskilim b'chol chachma. They were very, very bright. They were strong, yodei dat, mivinei mada, etc. And they would stand in front of the king, ulilamdam sefer. It says they would teach them the books, ulashon kasdim, in the language. And then the king would give them food every day, so they didn't have to work. They would be taken care of. And then it says at the end of the pasuk, they would legadlam shanim shalosh. They would raise them for 3 years. Umiksatam yamdu l'fnei hamelech. At the end of 3 years, some of them would pass the test and would stand in front of the king, right? And so you see that 3 years is the amount of time. If you don't finish by 3 years, then you're not going to do it. So he argues and says it's 3 years. Legadlam, it says in the pasuk, shenemar ulegadlam shanim shalosh, right? It's out of order here. L'lamdam sefer v'lashon kasdim. The Idach, now the first opinion that says you need 5 years, well, that's different. But there they only had a 3-year school because what's the big deal? You're learning a little bit of language and literature and art and diplomacy and Lashon Kastim. That's Khalil. That's an easy topic. It's not like learning Kachim and Tarot, which takes much longer. So yeah, it's true. If you have an easy topic, like, I don't know, medicine, maybe then 3 years, but something complicated should be longer. Idach, and the other opinion, of course, is that no. Shani hilchot avodah takifim. The exception is not the kasdim. The exception is avodah. Sure, you need 5 years as a Levi because that's really complex. But for normal things, you only need 3 years. So either way, 3 or 5 years. Tanu Rabbanan now, 6 lines in the bottom. Says the Braita, what about Kohanim? What is the age boundaries for Kohanim? So says the Braita, a Kohen mishayavi shtei sarot. As soon as they become mature, which is always the zman of shtei sarot, bar mitzvah, 13 and shtei sarot, then Achi Yasken, until they become old, right? Now we're going to have to define old, of course, but until they become old, kasher avodah. A Kohen can do avodah, but of course, mumin, so puslim bahen. If they have a mum, they're puzzled no matter what age they are. Ben Levi, now a Levi, as we said in the Braita and the Mishnah, ben shloshim ben chamishim kasher la'avodah. They are kosher only from 30 to 50. Vishanim poslim bo. And although mum does not puzzle, when they turn more than 50, or if they're younger than 30, they're puzzle. B'medvar mum, says the Braita, as we said earlier, ba'ol mo'ed shebemidbar. That's only true in the desert when you have a lot of carrying and building. Alpha b'shilo b'beit olamim ein nifsalim. They don't become puzzle with turning 50. Ella b'kol. They only become puzzle when their voice goes, right? Because the whole point, or the major point, so there's actually, the Rambam seems to say that even when their voice goes, they can't sing, they still can do other jobs, meaning it's a job-specific kind of thing. So that but the main job in the Beit HaMikdash was singing, and if your voice changes as you get older and you no longer can carry the tune or project, you no longer can serve in the choir. Amar Reb Yossi, now says Reb Yossi Ma'ikra, where do you see from a pasuk that the voice of the Leviim is the main function once you get to the Beit HaMikdash? Because the pasuk says, "Vayihi ke'achad mechatzatzrim." Right, this is the pasuk describing the Beit HaMikdash. They were like one with the trumpeters, l'mishorarim, and the singers, la'ashmiya kol echad. They had to hear one sound. If you have someone who's not singing with the choir, then they would get booted. So there was a complicated test for being a Levi. Now, the Mishnah, the Braita that we just quoted said, mine is a two dots. I don't really know why there's a two dots here, but mine is in the second line of Daf, Chaf Daled Amabet, Ad Yaskin. You remain a Kohen until you become old. I mean, not you're a Kohen, but you can serve in the Beit HaMikdash until you become old. What does that mean? What does old mean? There's a lot of debates, right, among different groups of people about what old means, right? So what's our definition? Ad Kama. Amar Reb Allah, Amar Reb Chanina. This is a beautiful, beautiful Gemara, to be very honest. But Ad Yiratate, until you start shaking, right? Now, that's also a very vague just description for clarity. Obviously, there are many illnesses of age, like Parkinson's, where people shake. But even people who don't have those illnesses, as you become weaker physically and maybe mentally, your balance is off. You start trembling, right? So that is the time where you should step down from avodah. Again, it's very vague. But it's not okay, anyway. So let's leave it at that. Says the Gemara. Well, let's have a whole nother discussion about age, and this is a fascinating discussion from a Mishnah in I think where's the Mishnah in Mikvaot. So the halacha is that a man who's roa keri, a man who ejaculates semen, is tamei. He's a bal keri. The issue the Mishnah comes out with is that let's say a person has an ejaculate and then he goes to the mikveh right away. And then he doesn't urinate before he goes to the mikveh. And then after he goes to the mikveh, he goes to the bathroom and he urinates. So we worry that he didn't completely ejaculate when he before, and there was some left in his penis. And now that he ejaculated, he becomes tummy again. Okay, so that is the issue of the Mishnah and Mikvaot. So says the Mishnah, it's not a tab. Bal keri shetaval. A bal keri, a person who saw semen, he then went to a mikvah. V'lo hitil maim. He didn't urinate before he went to the mikvah. And then after he goes to the mikvah, he urinates. The kishiatil tamei. You become tamei again. Because we have to assume you didn't evacuate everything. There's a little bit of semen left. And then when it comes out of your body, then you become tamei all over again. You got to go back to the mikvah. So the lesson is urinate before you go to the mikvah, right? That's the Mishnah. Now that's the Tanakama. Rabbi Yossi says it depends on how healthy the person is. If the person is a choleh, they're sick, they have pneumonia, or zakein, or they're old, then you assume that they didn't get everything out. And then they're tamei because they didn't remove all the semen. When they go urinate after the mikvah, then a little bit more comes out. But if they're yeled ubebari, if they're a young, healthy person, then they have a good flow. The stream came out, and then tahar, even though they didn't urinate after they ejaculated before they went to the mikvah. Okay, that's the halacha of mikvaot. Very irrelevant halacha to us in Chullin. But the reason we're bringing it is that the Mishnah defines old and young, right? So how do you then, if you give an external definition of old and young, you have to define those things. So yeled ad kama, what is considered to be a young person, right? Is it young at heart? Obviously not. This is young physically. What does it mean? So says Rabbi Allah Rabbi Chanina, I think this is an incredible answer because it's very, very true medically and quite relevant today. Says Rabbi Allah in the name of Rabbi Chanina, it depends on your balance and your strength. Kol she'omed al raglo achat v'choletz min alo v'noel min alo, that person is considered young. If you can stand on one leg, you can balance on one foot, reach down to your other foot, take off your sandal, which is like taking off your boots, right? Sandals were woven, they had ties all around them. So you have to be able to balance, use strength, bend over, move things, which I probably couldn't do, to be honest, though. So it's very
I can't either.
right. So I mean, this is really one, and we actually test people on standing on one foot, doing tasks. Right. So if you've got to sit down to take off your boots, then you're not young anymore. Sorry. So that's the shear, which is a fascinating shear, right? And in fact, says the Gemara, Amru alav Rabbi Chanina, that they said about Rabbi Chanina, who was quoted as saying this shear, that he shaya ben shmonim shana, when he was 80 years old, haya omed al raglo achat v'choletz min alo, noel min alo. He preserved, again, it's a very individual thing, right? Meaning some people at 30 can't do this, some people at 60 can't do it. Rabbi Chanina was 80 years old and he was able to do this. And because he obviously did Pilates every morning, right? No doubt. And says Rabbi Chanina, you know why why I have such good strength, why I can do my triathlons when I'm in my 80s? Because chamin v'shemen, the hot water and the oil, shesachatni imi b'yaldutai, that my mother put on me, the whatever creams and attention and heat my mother gave me when I was a kid, Haim Amduli B'Eid Ziknuti. This is what helped me in my old age, which is an incredible statement, right? That something about the way I was raised, obviously the easiest explanation is my bones, right? That when you have healthy childhood, your bones grow stronger and they stay. But obviously it goes beyond that here. And he was saying that my mother really set me up when I was a kid. Hopefully he kept it up his whole life. And when he was 80 years old, was able to balance and take off his shoes. And that means he would have been allowed to serve in the Beit HaMikdash, as a Kohen, because he still had that, not the Beit, I got confused. That means that you would still view him as being strong enough in this case of Kerry, that if he ejaculates, you assume it all comes out. Anyways, that is physical health that tells you that his body is working on all cylinders, let's say. So that is the very interesting shear from the Mishnah and Mikvaot. Continues the Gemara now back to our sugya of what age is working in the Beit HaMikdash. Tanur Abanan says the Braita, a very interesting Braita, which seems to go against our practice, but we'll see why in a second. Nitmalu zikno. When you get a full beard, this often we mean this a beard below, but this actually means a beard on your face. So when you get a beard, a full beard, now we don't know what full means, but let's just say you get a full beard, right? Then when a man has that status, ra'oi liyasot shliach tzibor. They are then able to be made a shliach tzibor. Now, Rashi and Tosafot both explain that this does not mean shliach tzibor like davening, because the next words are le'reid lifnei teva, and you can go down in front of the ark and lead the services. So shliach tzibor here does not mean, as we usually mean davening, it means a messenger of the tzibor, meaning you can do public functions like blow the shofar for everyone, or be assigned an agent, a parnas, Rashi says, I think, of the tzibor. You can be assigned to someone who is the messenger of the tzibor. And you can be le'reid lifnei teva. You can go down in front of the ark, which means presumably only on a high day, like the fast day or Yom Kippur, where you need to have someone very senior for that. Not senior, but somewhat experienced. V'lisat kapav, and you can do nisiat kabayim. You could do birkat kohanim. Tosfos points out that there's other Gemara in Megillah and also in Tanit that talks about people doing these things even if they're just an adult, not if they're nitmalei zikno. Tosfos understands that at least for the Birkat Kohanim, it means you can't do it by yourself, right? That you can do it, and we have this practice that the young boys, even before Bar Mitzvah, do it with their parents, but you can't be the only person up there unless you're Nitmalei Zikno. And in terms of the Teva, which of course you don't need to be 25 to daven mincha, right? But it means a special occasion, like a fast day, not a regular day. So that's his explanation. Now, me'ematai kasher la'avodah. When are you kosher to do avodah in the Beit HaMikdash if you're a kohen? Mishiyavi shtei sarot. As soon as you are an adult and you're mature, you're 13 years old, and you have two hairs, then you are allowed to do avodah. Rebbe says, no. Even I don't agree with that. Omer ani, I say achi ben esrim. Achi he ben esrim. You have to be 20 years old to work as a kohen in the Beit HaMikdash. Amar Rav Chisda, my time in the Rebbe. Says Rav Chisda, what's Rebbe's source that you have to be 20? Because it says, Vayamidu et Leviim, they stood up the Leviim, mi ben esrim shana v'mala, linnatseach amalekhet Beit Hashem. They stood up the Leviim. Now we're going to ask in a second how we prove from the Leviim that a Kohen has to be 20. But the pasuk in Ezra, when it's talking about going and rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, it says they stood up the Leviim who were 20 years and older to be natseach, which literally means to oversee and manage the Melechet Beit Hashem. Now, the argument against Rebbe is that was because they were overseeing it. They weren't working, they were the Natseach, right? The Natseach Shani, which means they were in charge of things. So then you got to be 20 to be a manager, but you don't need to be 20 in order to do the Avodah. You could be 13 or 14 years old. Says Gemara, well, I don't understand how Rebbe proves anything from this pasuk. It says Levi, ha-krab Leviim ktiv. This pasuk is referring to the Vayamidu ha-Leviim. Says the Gemara, of course, often Leviim, especially later in the Tanakh, means Kohanim. Could Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, be'esrim va'arba mekomot nikru Kohanim Leviim. In 24 different places in the Tanakh, or Torah and Nevi'im, well, I guess this is Ketuvim as well, the Kohanim are called only Leviim, sometimes Kohanim Leviim, but sometimes only Leviim. And obviously the proof for one of them is Kohanim ha-Leviim b'nei Tzadok. When it talks in Yecheskel about the end times, and you have the Beit HaMikdash, it says the Kohanim, the Leviim, who come from Tzadok, and of course Tzadok was a Kohen. So there it's referring to Kohanim, but they're called Kohanim Leviim. So, anyways, that is Rebbe's proof. Maybe it's not quite a proof, it's an asmachta from a pasuk in Ezra, right? It's not exactly a pasuk from the Torah. Tanur Rabbanan, says the Gemara, now how in the world do you know anything that you have to even be 13, that a 6-year-old is puzzle? Because the pasuk says, when it's talking about mumim, it says ish mizaracha ledoratam. If you have a man from your generation, from your family, for all generations, who gets a mum, they can't be in the Beit HaMikdash. But mikan amar Rebbe Elazar, from this pasuk, Rebbe Elazar proved that a katan pasal avodah, right? That you have to be an ish. You have to start off by being a man. Afilu tam. So katan, even if they have no wounds, but they're not an ish, is pasal avodah. Me'ematai kasher lavodah. So when does, according to this Braita, when does a Kohen become able to actually start working in the Beit HaMikdash? Mishiyavi shtei sarot. From when they become just an adult, the minimum age of 13 and shtei sarot. Aval, says the Braita, achiv ha-kohanim emi nichinoto lavodah ben esrim. But there was a lot of competition, and there was a lot of control going on. And although technically a 13 or 14-year-old could do it, the seniors, meaning the 20-year-olds, right, would block them and they wouldn't let them do it because they would say, you're not mature enough, you're not educated enough, this is not for you. Now, the question is, Ikad Amri, some say that that's the opinion of Rebbe, right? Remember, Rebbe, we just said quoted a pasuk or had a reference of a pasuk in Ezra that you have to be 20, right? And what Rebbe is saying is you're 20 because that was the practice. But afilu psul drabanan letle. There's no reason you couldn't do it when you're under 20. It's just the way it was is that they didn't let the young people do it, right? The old people, not the old people, the 20-year-old people, the 25-year-old people would block. It's like, they have like many things like this, like in Hatzalah, right? They make you go through a process before they let you do it, even though you could do it. But Ikad Amri, some say, no, no, no. Rebbe uses the pasuk in Ezra to say itlei psul midrabanan. That in fact, when up till the age of 20 is pasul, meaning midrabanan, you can't do avodah in the Beit Hamikdash. And this Braita, which says that the Achiva Kohanim would prevent them from doing it, that's the Rabbanan who says lichatchila hudelo, that really the brothers, the Achiva Kohanim would stop you from doing it lichatchila, but the avodah if you did it, avodato kshira, right, in a pinch, or if you had a very precocious kid and they let him through and he was 15, it would be no problem and it would be kosher. It's just that they didn't let him do it because they didn't think it was respectful or he was trained enough or there wasn't enough opportunity. But b'diavad, it would be kosher, unlike Rebbe, who made it sound from a pasuk like it's at least midrabanan, pasal if you're less than 20. So that is that Mishnah. See, it's much easier because we get all these Mishnayot breaking it up. That is that the halacha of Levi and Kohen. The next Mishnah that we have is gets us into a sugya, which is going to take us a lot of tomorrow. So I hope everyone pays attention. This is a complicated sugya. I'm going to give a little background. I can't say I'm an expert in this. So if I say something wrong, correct me. But the bottom line is that there are generally, halacha generally is that if a mate makes something, I'm going to go through tarot very quickly here, maybe in 4 minutes. So if someone dies, right, a mate is mitame by touching someone or be'ohel, right? If something is in the room where there's a dead body, then there's tuma in that room, okay? That's major tuma. Other things are tameh like sheret. So let's say a dead animal is usually not mitameh. There are some exceptions, right? There are shmona shrotzim. We're going to learn later what they are. I don't think anyone knows, but we're going to learn later what they are, that are mitamim. So the Torah describes and says if you have a sheret that falls on something, asher yipol alav benivlatam, when it's dead, it makes it tameh. So a sheret is capable of making an object, meaning a kli, tameh. Okay? When that kli is tameh, that becomes a rishon l'tuma. That becomes a rishon l'tuma. Right, the sheretz makes it a rishon. It can be mitame other food stuff that come in contact with it. Most tuma happens through touching, so that if a kli becomes tameh and then it touches food, that food becomes tameh. The exception to that rule is what's called a kli cheres. Okay, by a kli cheres, which is an earthenware kli, the Torah says some very interesting halachot. And one of the things it says, and I'm going to read now a pasuk in Vayikra Yud Aleph, it says the kol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho. Any kli cheres which this they is referring to the shratzim, that fall el tocho into the kli cheres, kol asher betocho yitma, everything that's in that kli cheres becomes tameh, assuming there's food in there. The oto tishboru, and you got to break the kli cheres. You can never be mitaher a kli cheres. You got to throw it away, destroy it. We learn from this pasuk, we're going to learn today and tomorrow, several important halachot. First of all, the tuma doesn't have to touch the kli cheres. It just has to go el tocho, which means into its inside space, meaning its airspace. And so let's say a sheretz is dropped into the kli cheres and then pulled out. It made the kli cheres tameh, and everything within the kli cheres also becomes tameh, right? So let's say there's a bunch of food, or you put the food in later, right? Because the kli cheres becomes a status of tuma once the sheretz was inside it. If you take out the sheretz, the kli cheres remains tameh. It's not because it's still there. It makes the kli cheres tameh. The other thing that we learn very interestingly, which we're about to learn in the Mishnah, is that actually if the sheretz touches the kli cheres on the outside, it doesn't become tameh. That the only way for a kli cheres to become tameh is for a object that defines tuma, let's say in this case a sheretz, to go inside the kli, okay? And we'll see how we know that. The opposite of a kli cheres, or meaning everything else, is called kli shetef. And kli shetef means a kli that you can wash. And the reason it's called that is that unlike a kli cheres, which if it becomes tamei, you have to break it and throw it away, other kelim, like metal kelim and let's say metal, right? Metal kelim, you can put them in a mikvah and they can be washed off of their tumah. So every other kli is the tumah is exactly the opposite. Meaning, if you have a metal pan and you put a sheretz into the airspace of that pan, the pan does not become tamei. The bowl does not become tamei unless it touches it. So they don't become tamei through airspace. They only become tamei through touching. So let's read that in the Mishnah now. Tahar b'kli cheres, that which is tahar by kli cheres, which is if a sheretz touches the outside, is tamei b'kol hakelim. That would be tamei in all other kelim. But tahar b'kol hakelim, tamei b'kli cheres. And now says the Braita. The Braita always speaks this out for us. Tanura banan, avir kli cheres tamei. The airspace of a kli cheres, if you put a sheretz or another thing that causes tumah into the airspace of a kli cheres, that kli cheres becomes tamei, and everything inside of it becomes tamei. But gabo, if you touch the outside of a kli cheres, it's tahor. Right now, obviously, if you touch the inside, the only way to touch the inside is to go through the airspace, right? So it would be tamei. But if you took a sheretz and you touch the outside, a dead sheretz, it would still be tahor. Other kelim are the opposite. Avir kol kelim tahor. The airspace of other kelim, if a sheretz went into that airspace, the kli remains tahor as long as it didn't touch it. The gaban tamei, but the outside of them is tamei, meaning if a sheretz touches it, the kli becomes tamei. Nimsa, turns out, tahar b'kli cheres, that which is not a problem with kli cheres, meaning touching, is tamei b'kol kakelim, and tahar b'kol hakelim, that which is okay in other kelim, which is the airspace without touching, is tamei b'kli cheres. Okay, so that's a very straightforward halacha. Ask the Gemara, 6 lines on the bottom, 2, 4, 6, 7 lines on the bottom. Mina hani mili. What's the source for this? The Tanu Rabbanan, based on the pasuk that I just read to you, I'll read it again. It says in Vayikra Yud Aleph Lamed Gimel, "V'kol kli cheres asher yipol mehem." Any kli cheres which should fall from them, again, from them in this context, is a sheretz, which the Torah has just said makes things tamei. If that dead sheretz falls into the kli cheres, el tocho, into its space, kol asher bitocho yitma, everything that's in that space is tamei v'otot tishaber, and you should break the kli. Says the Braita, how do you know this? Tanu Rabbanan, tocho. You know from the word tocho that if the sheretz falls into the space of the kli cheres, it's tamei. Afa pisha lo naga, even if the sheretz does not touch the kli. Says Gemara, how do you know it means that? Maybe tocho means it falls inside and it touches it. You're saying it means even though it didn't touch it. Oh, maybe it means if a sheretz falls into it means it falls into the bowl and touches the bowl. How do you know it doesn't mean that? Rabbi Yonatan ben Avtumis Omer says, Rabbi Yonatan ben Avtumis, the reason is because Nemer tochol litamei, v'nemer tochol litamei. Right? It says tochol. I'll read the pasuk again. I've read it several times. It's a complicated pasuk. Kol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho. The tumah of the sheretz goes into it. Kol asher bitocho, any object that's in it becomes tamei. So says Rabbi Yonatan ben Avtumis, we're talking about the kli becoming tamei from a sheretz coming inside of it, and then once the kli is tamei, everything that's inside of it becomes tamei. So we have to compare tocho, that which comes into it and that which is in it, meaning making the kli tamei from the sheretz, and the kli making food tamei from its tumah. So nemar tocho litamei, v'nemar tocho litamei. It says tocho about the kli becoming tamei, and tocho about the kli making other things tamei. Just like ma tocho ha'amar litamei. Just like tocho about the kli making things tamei is afal pishalon naga. Everything in this pot becomes tamei, even if it didn't touch the walls of the pot. So af tocho ha'amor litamei. So when the pot becomes tamei, afal pishalon naga. It's even if the sheretz didn't touch the kli, it just went into the airspace. Says, how do you know? Why are you making such a big assumption that everything in the kli becomes tamei, even if it didn't touch the walls of the kli? V'hata minalan, Rabbi Yonatan, it's logical because the Torah says everything in the kli becomes tamei. Let's say you had hatorah hidal kli cheres, afilu maloch hardal. Let's say it's filled with mustard seeds. I always like to use the sunflower seeds as my example because I relate to them. Right? Let's say you take 1,000 sunflower seeds, you pour it into your kli. Obviously, they're not all touching the walls of the kli, right? There's space. They're touching each other. But the Torah never implies, oh, no, only the outside ones are tamei. Inside ones are not tamei. Rashi points out, you can't say that the outside one becomes tamei and makes the next one tamei and the next one tamei, because first of all, food is not tamei other food. And second of all, the outside one would be a rishon, then a sheni. There's no such thing as a chamishi, revi, shishi, right? There would be no tuma that would spread that way. So basically, what you see from here is, I think we'll stop here. What you see from here is a gzera shava toho, that just like when objects within a kli cheres, if you have a kli cheres that's tamei, and then you pour your mustard seeds into it, all the mustard seeds are considered to be toho. They're considered to be in it, and they're all tamei, even though they're not touching it. So you see that it's not the touch that matters, it's the space. And so the same thing is true when the kli becomes tamei by a sheretz going into it. It doesn't mean the sheretz has to touch it. It means the dead sheretz has to be in the airspace, and then the kli becomes tamei. And so we're going to stop here, but tomorrow I hope everyone joins at 7:45 to continue the next detail, which is so that now we just proved that a kli cheres becomes tamei in its airspace. And now we also know that a regular kli becomes tamei by touching it. We're going to ask tomorrow, how do you know that what applies to one does not apply to the other? So, yasher koach. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.